Welcome back. Today I'm making this adorable baby penguin cake. This cake uses quite a few cake layers, and it actually is made with 1.5 batches of my go-to layer cake recipe. The full recipe is up on Chelsweets.com, and I ended up coloring some of the batter a light gray shade, and then popping some white circles into the center of them, just that way when we cut into the cake, it will mirror the look of the white tummy that we're going to give the penguin. So I'm frosting this with some gray buttercream as well, and to get this shade I actually used a bit of black cocoa in my frosting, and I also added a couple drops of black gel food coloring. So you don't need a lot here, just a little bit will get you that nice shade. I frosted the edges of the cake with a gray buttercream and then filled the center with just plain white buttercream, and I repeated that process with 3 of these cake layers that have the white centers. I wanted the frosting to match the cake layers, of course, just to give it a really seamless look when we do slice into it. To give this penguin his adorable shape, we're going to taper the cake layers going up. So I'm adding onto my 7-inch cake layers here a 6-inch cake round, and then I'm topping this with one of the centers of the cake layers that we actually cut out. So that is the same size cutout as we used to make those white circles. So at this point, if you wanted to, you could use a serrated knife and trim away some of your cake, but to keep things simple, I chose to just add a little bit of extra buttercream and kind of round out those sides to give the penguin its tapered shape. Using an acetate sheet, I then smoothed out the sides and scraped away any excess frosting on the side of a bowl. And while an offset spatula does work great, for cakes that have rounded sides like this, an acetate sheet makes it so much easier to frost, and I highly recommend them. I order mine on Amazon in a large package and then trim them down to whatever size I need. At this point, I chilled the cake in the freezer for about 10 minutes until the frosting was firm to the touch, and then I began to work on the penguin's head. And it's important that you chill the cake because it helps keep the bottom of the cake stable and really gives it structure as you add on that. Really, the head is kind of a second tier. If you wanted to, you could definitely build it on a separate cake round and use some dowels to help support it. But I didn't want to make this cake more complicated than it already was with all of these layers, so I decided to just build it on top. As you can see though, I'm being super careful as I'm frosting this. I'm not applying a lot of pressure, and I'm really taking my time and having a really nice light touch. I ended up using a 4-inch cake round for kind of like the neck of the penguin, and then I worked my way back up to some 6-inch cake rounds. I did trim them a bit with a serrated knife to help give it a little bit more of a spherical shape, but for the most part, I'm really going to use frosting to help round everything out. At this point in time, I realized I really needed a center dowel in this cake to help keep things stable, so I inserted one right through the center before I finished frosting. If you want to, you could definitely do this earlier in the process to help keep everything in place and to not have to worry too much as you're stacking your layers. Once they were all covered, I used my handy dandy acetate sheet one more time, and I slowly worked my way up the side of the penguin's head to give it a nice round shape. And this part doesn't have to be perfectly smooth because you are going to be adding some feathers onto it, but I did my best job. And then I moved on to creating some fondant accents for the penguin's beak, nose, and eyes. So I took 3 equal amounts of orange fondant and I shaped one into a beak, and the other 2 I shaped into the penguin's feet. I kind of made them into circles and then used a knife to cut a few lines into them to create the penguin's toes. I set these aside to firm up a bit, and then I began to work on frosting my penguin. So first I started outlining the shape of my penguin's face, just using an offset spatula. Kind of was in the shape of a heart, and I then began to pipe some white frosting to create the penguin's stomach, and also of course to pipe some white buttercream in for its face. I was pretty generous with the amount of white buttercream that I added, but you could definitely add less, you don't need this much. I did my best job to smooth this out using my offset spatula, and then I began to add on those fondant accents. So first was his nose. I then added on 2 little eyes that I made with some black and white fondant, and then I placed his feet at the bottom of the cake. I wanted to get these in place before I started piping on all the little feathers. I also piped on some additional buttercream to be the penguin's wings. If you don't want to use this much frosting, you could always use some leftover cake layers and either just cut them out to be this shape, or you could even mix some crumbled up cake layers with a bit of frosting, kind of like a cake ball, and shape it into the wings. At this point, the only thing left to do was to cover the entire cake in almost what looks like fur, but I'm really trying to emulate the tiny, really delicate feathers that baby penguins have. So I was really channeling kind of a happy feet look here. But I used a grass piping tip. You can use any grass piping tip that you have. Mine is a Wilton, and it took quite a bit of hand strength to cover the cake. I started off small by just focusing on the white feathers, and then I went to town on the gray feathers. So I took a few breaks while I was doing this. It definitely can wear your hands out, and also the heat from your hand can sometimes change the consistency or even the color of your buttercream. So if you are going to do this for extended periods of time, you can always use a paper towel like I'm doing here, or use a kitchen towel to wrap around your piping bag to help minimize the transfer of heat into your frosting. So by the time I finally got to the back of the penguin, I realized that he needed a little tail. So I added on a bit of extra buttercream to give that a little bit of shape, and then this little baby penguin cake was complete. I felt kind of bad cutting into him, especially into his back. I felt like I was kind of stabbing him in the back, but it had to be done, and I still think it's better than cutting into the front. Don't forget the recipe for this cake is up on Chelsweets.com, and let me know what cakes you'd like to see next.